There is a growing psychological crisis that most people never notice. The more they compare themselves to others, the less they understand who they actually are. Most people assume that comparing themselves to others is a natural part of life. They see it as motivation, as a way to measure progress, or as a harmless habit that everyone practices. But modern psychology reveals something very different. Comparison does not simply influence self-perception, it gradually replaces it. The more a person looks outward to understand their value, the less capable they become of perceiving who they are without external reference points. Identity begins to shift from something internally defined to something socially constructed. What makes this process especially dangerous is that it happens quietly. Individuals believe they are evaluating themselves objectively, when in reality, they are reacting to an artificial hierarchy shaped by visibility, status, and curated images. The mind becomes dependent on external markers, not because they represent truth, but because they are immediate and easy to use. Kahneman described this as the mind's reliance on heuristics. Any information that reduces cognitive effort becomes automatically preferred. Comparison becomes a shortcut for self-understanding, even though it provides none. Most people don't realize how fragile their sense of identity becomes under these conditions. When self-worth depends on comparison, it becomes unstable, because comparison never ends. Someone is always more successful, more admired, more accomplished, more visible. The goalposts shift continuously, creating a form of psychological instability that feels normal only because it is widespread. And once identity becomes unstable, people lose the internal reference points needed for independent thinking, emotional resilience, and long-term direction. So before we continue, take a moment to subscribe if you genuinely find this kind of content valuable. The next step is to understand how this illusion of knowing yourself through others forms, why the mind accepts it, and how it slowly dissolves the foundation of personal identity. Modern individuals often assume they possess a stable and coherent sense of identity. They believe their preferences, attitudes, values, and long-term goals emerge from an internal psychological core that develops independently of external influence. But when examined carefully, this assumption does not hold. Much of what people call the self is constructed through continuous social comparison, a process so pervasive and automatic that most individuals do not perceive it as an influence at all. They mistake comparison-driven adaptations for authentic personal qualities, unaware that their identity reflects external pressures more than internal reasoning. The first problem arises from the fundamental architecture of human cognition. The mind does not evaluate itself in isolation. It evaluates itself relative to others. This tendency has roots in evolutionary psychology and social cognition. People understand their abilities, value, attractiveness, intelligence, and success primarily through contrasts. They do not ask, "Who am I?" They ask, "Who am I compared to others?" This shift appears subtle, but it fundamentally alters how identity forms. Instead of building a sense of self from intrinsic principles, individuals assemble it from external reference points. When comparison becomes the basis of self-evaluation, identity becomes unstable, reactive, and dependent. A second issue that comparative thinking creates a distorted framework for self-understanding. Social comparison is rarely objective. People tend to compare themselves selectively, upward when seeking evaluation, downward when seeking reassurance. Upward comparisons lead to dissatisfaction, perceived inadequacy, and the sense that one is perpetually behind. Downward comparisons create temporary relief, but do not contribute to genuine self-knowledge. Both processes undermine autonomy, because the self becomes a reflection of whichever comparison dominates at a given moment. Identity shifts with context rather than developing from internal coherence. Another dimension of the problem comes from the modern informational environment, which amplifies comparison beyond natural levels. In earlier eras, comparison was limited to local communities. People had access to a narrow set of social benchmarks. Modern individuals, by contrast, are exposed to curated lives, idealized images, and selectively presented achievements of thousands of others. But the mind processes these curated representations as real competitors. As a result, individuals build their identity in response not to actual human beings, but to filtered, exaggerated, and often artificial standards. This distortion produces identity structures that are unattainable and psychologically damaging. Social media intensifies this effect. Algorithms are designed to elevate content that provokes strong emotional reactions, including envy and admiration. This creates an environment where individuals evaluate themselves against unrealistic standards on a daily basis. The comparative pressure becomes constant. People modify their goals, behavior, self-presentation, and even personality traits to align with externally rewarded patterns. The self becomes less a product of internal reasoning and more a product of external reinforcement. The more a person compares, the more they adapt. And the more they adapt, the further they drift from their authentic preferences. The psychological mechanism underlying this process is straightforward. Repeated comparison activates the need for social approval. When the mind perceives itself as inferior or inadequate, it compensates by adjusting behavior to reduce social distance. Individuals unconsciously align their values with those who appear more successful or admired. Over time, these alignments accumulate and form the basis of identity. But because the adaptations respond to shifting social signals, the resulting identity lacks stability. It fluctuates with trends, expectations, and collective sentiment. Self-esteem becomes tethered to external metrics. People feel valuable only when they outperform others or meet socially validated standards, but external metrics are inherently unstable. They shift with cultural norms, economic conditions, and technological trends. When identity depends on such metrics, it becomes vulnerable. Minor fluctuations in social approval can cause significant psychological distress. The self becomes fragile because it is continuously measured against benchmarks outside of personal control. Another consequence of comparison-based identity is the erosion of intrinsic motivation. When individuals base their goals on external models, they pursue achievements not because they align with their values, but because they align with what others reward. This leads to misaligned ambitions. People chase success categories that are socially admired even if those categories do not match their strengths or desires. As a result, they experience a persistent sense of dissatisfaction, even when they achieve their goals. The dissatisfaction is not due to failure, but due to pursuing goals that never belong to them. In addition, comparison disrupts internal coherence. Authentic identity requires consistency across different contexts. A person must recognize stable principles that guide decisions regardless of social fluctuations. But comparison-based identity produces fragmentation. A person behaves one way in one environment, another way in a different environment, adjusting constantly to maintain social acceptance. This fragmentation undermines the sense of self, leaving individuals unsure of their values when external signals disappear. They feel lost not because they lack intelligence or willpower, but because their identity was built on unstable foundations. Comparative thinking also affects moral judgment. When people adopt values through comparison, they often endorse principles that align with social norms rather than personal conviction. They support popular opinions not because they have evaluated them, but because deviation from the majority feels psychologically risky. This conformity weakens moral autonomy. Individuals cease to examine whether their beliefs reflect their reasoning or merely reflect their desire for social integration. The distinction becomes blurred, and moral identity becomes performative rather than reflective. A further complication is that comparison shifts the locus of control from internal to external. People begin to perceive themselves as successful or unsuccessful based on social benchmarking rather than personal development. This external orientation reduces agency. Individuals feel controlled by circumstances, trends, and the perceived achievements of others. This mindset undermines resilience. When faced with challenges, individuals do not rely on their internal capacities. Instead, they evaluate how their struggle compares to others' experiences. This comparison intensifies stress and diminishes self-trust. Over time, social comparison creates a cognitive loop in which individuals continually reconstruct their identity in response to feedback. Identity becomes a product of external expectations rather than internal design. People lose sight of their genuine preferences, values, and long-term goals. They may experience success but remain unsatisfied, not because their achievements lack meaning, but because the achievements were chosen as responses to comparison, not as expressions of self. This leads to a final psychological consequence: the weakening of personal authenticity. Authenticity requires awareness of one's values, consistency in behavior, and the courage to act in accordance with internal principles. Social comparison undermines all three. It distracts individuals from introspection, encourages adaptation without critical evaluation, and ties self-worth to external judgment. As comparison deepens, authenticity fades. The self becomes a mirror, not a source. If social comparison has always existed as a natural psychological mechanism, the modern environment has transformed it from an occasional tendency into a permanent cognitive condition. Comparison used to be a contextual behavior, something that occurred when people interacted directly within small communities. Now it has become the background state of the mind. Individuals compare themselves reflexively, continuously, and often without conscious awareness. This shift is not accidental. It is the result of structural changes in how people connect, communicate, and present themselves. Understanding these structural changes is crucial for explaining why comparison has become so destructive to personal identity. The first transformation is permanent visibility. In previous generations, people did not have constant access to other people's lives, achievements, or opinions. They saw only fragments, and those fragments were filtered through direct interaction. Today, visibility is continuous, unfiltered, and artificially curated. Social platforms ensure that individuals are exposed to an endless stream of other people's successes, behaviors, lifestyles, and identities. This constant exposure creates a psychological imbalance. People see others from the outside, but themselves from the inside. They judge others by visible outcomes, but judge themselves by internal uncertainties. The imbalance increases the likelihood of distorted conclusions about self-worth. The second transformation is selective representation. People do not present their lives as they are. They present them as they wish to be perceived. Achievements are highlighted, struggles are concealed. Confidence is exaggerated, doubt is hidden. This selective representation creates unrealistic social baselines. Individuals compare their ordinary lives to others' exceptional moments. They do this not because they seek comparison, but because the environment normalizes these curated portrayals as everyday reality. When the mind continually measures itself against amplified fragments, the sense of inadequacy grows even when the comparison lacks validity. Another structural factor is quantified social approval. Likes, views, shares, ratings, and follow accounts convert social comparison into measurable data. The human mind evolved to interpret quantity as significance. When approval becomes numerical, individuals begin to equate numbers with value. This leads to a cognitive shift. The social environment becomes a scoreboard, and the self becomes a competitor. Even people who consciously reject such metrics feel subtle pressure when they see others receiving visible approval. The mind, trained to interpret numbers as status, internalizes the hierarchy automatically. This quantification of social value intensifies comparison because it gives the illusion of objectivity, even though the metrics themselves are arbitrary. A fourth transformation is algorithmic amplification. Platforms do not display content randomly, they amplify what drives engagement. Engagement is often driven by extreme examples: exceptional success, physical perfection, idealized lifestyles, or highly polarized opinions. As a result, individuals are consistently exposed to unrealistic standards. The mind interprets frequency as normality. When unrealistic examples appear repeatedly, they begin to feel typical, even though they represent statistical outliers. This distorted exposure makes people perceive themselves as below average when they are, in fact, within the normal range. Algorithmic amplification therefore reinforces feelings of inadequacy and intensifies the tendency to compare. Another structural factor is competition for attention. Modern communication platforms operate on attention economies. Individuals compete not for survival, but for visibility, relevance, and recognition. This competition shifts psychological priorities. Instead of focusing on internal development, people focus on external validation. Instead of cultivating personal identity, they cultivate performative identity. Performance becomes a way to secure recognition, and recognition becomes proof of value. In such an environment, comparison is not just a psychological tendency, it becomes a survival strategy in a social ecosystem that rewards those who present themselves in the most appealing, impressive, or dramatic ways. A sixth transformation is the disappearance of private identity. Traditionally, identity developed internally through reflection, introspection, and personal experience. Today, identity is frequently formed externally through feedback loops. Individuals present an image, receive responses, adjust the image, and repeat the cycle. Identity becomes iterative and externally shaped. Over time, people begin to rely less on internal cues and more on external signals to understand who they are. The process reverses. Instead of expressing identity outwardly, people construct identity based on outer reactions. Social comparison becomes the mechanism through which identity is calibrated. The environment also reinforces comparison through constant social proximity. In the past, people compared themselves within small, relatively homogeneous groups. Today, individuals can compare themselves to anyone: celebrities, high achievers, wealthy influencers, talented specialists, or idealized strangers. These comparisons are structurally unfair because the reference groups are artificially expanded. When people compare themselves to individuals far outside their realistic social sphere, the comparison inevitably produces distortions. The mind begins to perceive the extraordinary as the standard, creating a chronic sense of insufficiency. Another factor is continuous social ranking. Modern environments subtly rank individuals through symbols of status, lifestyle displays, educational backgrounds, professional achievements, aesthetics, or ideological positions. These rankings are rarely explicit, but they shape perception. People internalize hierarchies based on what they observe repeatedly. Even if they do not consciously endorse these hierarchies, the cognitive system adapts to them automatically. This creates a psychological climate where individuals constantly evaluate their place within an ever-shifting social hierarchy. A further contributing structure is identity fragmentation. Individuals today participate in multiple, overlapping social contexts, personal relationships, professional networks, ideological communities, digital platforms, and cultural subgroups. Each context has its own expectations. When people shift between contexts rapidly, they evaluate themselves against different standards, often incompatible with each other. This creates internal conflict and destabilizes identity. The more contexts a person navigates, the more comparisons they must perform. Identity becomes fragmented because the person tries to meet standards that cannot coexist within a single coherent self. Another structural factor is the elevation of presentation over substance. Environments that reward visibility prioritize those who perform identity successfully, not those who develop identity internally. This shift encourages individuals to compare themselves based on external markers. They can control appearance, signaling, opinions rather than on internal qualities, such as character, integrity, or intellectual depth. As a result, comparison becomes superficial, but its psychological impact remains deep. People compare themselves based on external performances and internalize the emotional consequences as if the comparison were meaningful. All these structural elements interact with human psychology in a way that intensifies comparison beyond natural levels. Permanent visibility, selective representation, quantified approval, algorithmic amplification, attention competition, shrinking private identity, expanded comparison groups, implicit ranking, identity fragmentation, and performance-based validation from a system that promotes comparison as a constant mental habit. This system does not merely encourage comparison. It normalizes it to the point where individuals no longer recognize it as a psychological process. It becomes the cognitive background of daily life. The result is predictable. When comparison becomes continuous, identity becomes unstable. And when identity becomes unstable, the person becomes dependent on the external world for self-definition. To understand the deeper consequences of this dependency, we must now examine how social comparison gradually dismantles the internal structures that support personal identity itself. If social comparison gradually erodes internal stability, then the next question is unavoidable: which psychological mechanisms actually make the self collapse under the weight of comparison? The answer lies in a series of predictable cognitive and emotional processes that reshape identity from the inside. These mechanisms do not require trauma, manipulation, or external pressure. They arise spontaneously whenever a person uses external reference points as the standard for self-evaluation, and once activated, they restructure thinking, distort emotional regulation, and weaken the individual's internal sense of self. The first mechanism is self-discrepancy amplification. When individuals compare themselves to others, they activate mental representations of the ideal self and not self, concepts well analyzed in social psychology. Comparison makes the distance between the real self and these internal standards feel larger than it actually is. The person begins to experience persistent cognitive tension. I should be better than I am, or I must become what others appear to be. This tension becomes not a motivator, but a destabilizer. The self is no longer evaluated in relation to its own progress, but in relation to an imagined gap constructed artificially by comparison. Over time, this produces chronic dissatisfaction, even when objective progress is present. A second mechanism is identity externalization. Instead of asking, "What do I value?" the individual gradually shifts toward, "What is valued by others?" The evaluative center moves from internal to external. As this shift continues, actions, decisions, and long-term goals become shaped less by personal conviction and more by perceived expectations. This is not conscious imitation, it is structural displacement. The person slowly loses the ability to make decisions without anticipating external judgment. Identity becomes reactive. The individual becomes a mirror that reflects external standards rather than a mind that produces its own. When identity becomes externalized, the individual is no longer the author of their behavior, but the executor of social scripts. A third mechanism is the collapse of intrinsic motivation. Research by Deci and Ryan shows that intrinsic motivation requires autonomy, competence, and a sense of internal purpose. Social comparison undermines all three. Autonomy declines because the individual's motivations shift toward outperforming others. Competence becomes distorted because perceived competence depends on relative standing rather than actual ability. Purpose becomes fragmented because the pursuit of external validation replaces long-term meaning. When intrinsic motivation erodes, individuals begin to pursue goals, not because they value them, but because those goals signal status within a social hierarchy. This produces burnout, emotional instability, and eventual identity confusion. A fourth mechanism is selective self-attention. Social comparison activates heightened awareness of personal weaknesses. Individuals attend to whatever they believe others do better. This creates a biased self-perception. Strengths are minimized, weaknesses are magnified, and achievements are reinterpreted as insufficient. The person's internal narrative becomes organized around perceived inadequacies. Even positive accomplishments lose psychological weight, because comparison reframes them as not enough. This mechanism is particularly destructive, because it produces the illusion that the individual is objectively evaluating themselves when, in reality, the evaluation is filtered through external standards. A fifth mechanism is value displacement. When people engage in comparison repeatedly, they gradually adopt the values of those they compare themselves to, even if these values contradict their own. For example, someone who never cared about material achievement may begin to measure their worth in economic terms simply because others do. Someone who valued creativity or abandon it for efficiency because efficiency appears socially rewarded. Values become borrowed, and once a person lives according to borrowed values, internal conflict becomes inevitable. The individual can no longer explain why they are pursuing certain goals except through reference to others. This destroys identity coherence, the consistency between beliefs, actions, and internal principles. Another mechanism is emotional dependency. The more a person compares themselves to others, the more their emotional states depend on external metrics. Self-worth becomes contingent on outperforming others or meeting perceived social expectations. Emotional life becomes unstable because external reference points constantly shift. A person may feel competent one moment and inadequate the next, depending on who they compare themselves to. This emotional volatility weakens identity, because stable identity requires stable emotional grounding. A seventh mechanism is distorted cognitive framing. Comparison reshapes the way individuals interpret experiences. Neutral events become evidence of personal failure. Success is dismissed as insufficient. Opportunities are seen not as chances for growth, but as tests that prove worth. The cognitive frame becomes defensive. The person constantly monitors how they are perceived, how they rank, how they measure up. This hyper-self-monitoring drains cognitive resources that could otherwise support self-development. The self becomes a performance rather than a lived experience. The eighth mechanism is the erosion of internal narrative authority. Identity depends on one's capacity to construct a coherent narrative. This is who I am. This is what I value. This is why I make these choices. Social comparison undermines narrative authority by introducing conflicting external narratives. The individual begins to borrow language, standards, and self-explanations from others. Their story becomes a collage of comparisons rather than a coherent internal structure. This fragmentation weakens confidence because the person no longer experiences themselves as the central actor in their own life. A ninth mechanism is the internalization of imagined judgment. People often assume others evaluate them more harshly than they actually do. Social comparison intensifies this bias. Individuals construct imaginary critics, projected observers, whose imagined disapproval dictates their behavior. This creates a form of internal surveillance. The person behaves as though constantly evaluated, even in solitude. Once this mental structure solidifies, the individual no longer needs real external pressure. Self-judgment becomes a full-time psychological function. Identity becomes restricted by fear rather than shaped by values. A tenth mechanism is identity diffusion. If comparison becomes the dominant mode of evaluation, the individual gradually loses a stable sense of self. Decisions feel arbitrary. Goals feel borrowed. Preferences become inconsistent. the person cannot distinguish between what they want and what is expected. This leads to a diffuse identity and unstable, externally defined self that cannot regulate emotions, maintain direction, or sustain commitment. Without a stable identity, independent thought collapses. The mind becomes highly malleable, receptive to external influence, and vulnerable to manipulation. Finally, all these mechanisms converge into self-alienation. The individual becomes psychologically separated from their own values, emotions, and judgments. They experience themselves not as an authentic center of agency, but as an object evaluated from the outside. Self-alienation is the final stage of identity erosion. The person no longer trusts their perception, their preferences, or their internal authority. Everything is filtered through the imagined perspective of others. Once this stage is reached, independence of thought is nearly impossible. The individual has lost internal grounding, and without grounding, identity becomes a shifting response to the surrounding environment. This brings us to the next essential question. How can a person rebuild identity once it has been eroded by comparison? The loss of personal identity under the pressure of social comparison does not occur in isolation. It is amplified by external systems that recognize comparison as a reliable method of influence. These systems, technological, economic, cultural, institutional, do not merely reinforce the tendency to compare. They depend on it for their functioning. In this sense, social comparison is not an accidental flaw of the modern mind, but a deliberately supported mechanism that keeps individuals predictable, compliant, and psychologically vulnerable. To understand why identity weakens, we must examine how these systems shape the very conditions in which comparison occurs. The first system that exploits comparison is a digital environment. Social platforms are designed to show people not who they are, but who they are supposed to be. The architecture ensures that individuals constantly witness curated achievements, filtered appearance standards, rewarded behaviors, and publicly validated identities. The platform turns comparison into an automatic cognitive reflex. Individuals compare because the environment is structured to provoke comparison, not because they consciously choose to evaluate themselves through others. Over time, users internalize the metrics of the platform, of metrics of personal worth. Visibility becomes a proxy for value. Engagement becomes a surrogate for identity. When the environment teaches the mind that identity must be confirmed externally, internal identity becomes secondary. A second system that reinforces comparison is the economic structure of modern society. Consumer culture functions by creating dissatisfaction. Identity becomes tied to symbols, products, experiences, lifestyle aesthetics because industries depend on individuals comparing themselves to higher status groups. The logic is simple. If people were stable in their identity, they would not be as easily persuaded to seek external improvement. Comparison creates a perpetual sense of deficiency, and deficiency drives consumption. This structure does not need to manipulate individuals directly. It only needs to maintain conditions where comparison feels necessary for self-definition. In such a system, identity becomes a shifting target aligned with market narratives rather than personal values. Another system is cultural expectation. Societies communicate subtly but persistently which identities are considered admirable, respectable, or successful. These expectations create templates of acceptable selves. Individuals learn early that deviation from these templates carries social cost. They internalize the standards and evaluate themselves according to them. Comparison becomes a tool to ensure conformity. People adjust their identity to match the dominant cultural narrative not because the narrative reflects their nature, but because alignment reduces friction. Over time, the cultural template replaces internal identity formation. Independent identity development becomes rare because the environment provides ready-made alternatives that require less psychological effort. Institutional systems also shape identity through comparison. schools, workplaces, and hierarchical organizations assign value through ranking, evaluation, and competitive metrics. Individuals are measured relative to others, not relative to their own development. These metrics create identities tethered to external assessment. A student becomes high-achieving or underperforming based on comparison. An employee becomes valuable or replaceable based on relative output. Institutions rarely encourage intrinsic identity discovery because intrinsic identity resists standardization. Comparison-based identity, however, is easy to monitor, shape, and control. As people internalize institutional evaluations, they adopt identities defined by roles rather than by self-understanding. Media systems contribute another layer of influence. Public narratives emphasize exceptional success, curated perfection, and socially validated lifestyles. Media does not simply reflect reality, it constructs an aspirational hierarchy. Comparison flows upward, toward unattainable ideals. This upward pressure creates chronic identity dissatisfaction. Individuals feel inadequate, not because they lack personal worth, but because they compare themselves to standards engineered to be unreachable. Identity becomes a pursuit of alignment with external narratives rather than a process of personal definition. Another mechanism that deepens the influence of comparison is emotional reinforcement. Comparison activates emotions envy, insecurity, pride, embarrassment that make the comparison memorable. Systems that benefit from comparison rely on emotional activation to maintain engagement. People return to comparison because it produces emotional stimulation, not because it clarifies identity. But emotional activation distorts judgment. When emotions dominate, identity becomes reactive. The self is reconstructed moment by moment based on the emotional outcome of comparison. At the psychological level, weakened attention exacerbates these influences. When attention is unstable, individuals cannot hold a coherent sense of self. The environment fills the cognitive gap with external identity cues. Comparison becomes the default method of self-recognition. Rather than forming identity internally, people infer identity by observing how they rank within social hierarchies. This is not identity. It is reflection, and reflections change constantly based on who happens to be nearby. Identity also weakens through information asymmetry. Individuals see the polished surfaces of others' lives, but remain intimately aware of their own doubts, limitations, and contradictions. Comparison becomes biased. People compare their internal uncertainty to others' external confidence. This asymmetry produces a systematic illusion others appear more stable, more accomplished, more certain. When this illusion is repeated, individuals begin to trust external images more than internal experience. Identity deteriorates because it is built on incomplete data. Another factor is the erosion of solitude. Without solitude, people cannot hear their own internal reasoning. They process themselves through the perceptions of others. The mind becomes socially entangled. Identity becomes a negotiation with external expectations rather than an internal construction. Systems that eliminate solitude, constant connectivity, immediate communication, permanent availability prevent individuals from retreating into the introspective space where identity stabilizes. Once comparison becomes habitual, identity becomes externally anchored. A person begins to see themselves not as an entity with intrinsic direction, but as a relative position within a hierarchy. The hierarchy changes, so identity changes. The person no longer asks, "What do I want?" but "How do I measure up?" Once identity becomes conditional on comparison, it becomes unstable. And unstable identity is easily influenced. These systems do not need to conspire or coordinate. Comparison emerges as a byproduct of their structure, yet the cumulative effect is powerful. Identity weakens because it is constantly evaluated, constantly contrasted, constantly questioned in relation to others. A self built on comparison cannot sustain itself without comparison, and therefore never becomes truly autonomous. To restore identity, individuals must understand the structural forces shaping their self-perception. Only then can they take deliberate steps to detach identity from comparison and construct it independently. That is the challenge the final section must address. If social comparison undermines identity by externalizing self-worth and redirecting attention toward the standards of others, then recovering a stable sense of self requires a deliberate shift in how the mind evaluates itself, interprets experience, and forms personal meaning. This recovery is not a matter of increasing confidence or adopting positive beliefs. It is a structural reorganization of how the individual defines value, constructs identity, and regulates internal judgment. Without such reorganization, a person inevitably returns to comparison, because comparison fills the vacuum created by an undefined self. The solution is not emotional reassurance, but cognitive autonomy. The first step is rebuilding internal reference points. When identity depends on comparison, the individual uses others as mirrors. To reverse this, the person must establish personal criteria for evaluating progress, success, effort, and meaning. These criteria must originate from internal reasoning, not from admiration or fear. This requires asking, what qualities do I value independently of external approval? What long-term goals reflect my own reasoning other than imitation? Internal reference points shift the evaluative axis from horizontal others to vertical self over time. The mind begins to measure progress against its previous state, not against the achievements of strangers. Over time, this transforms identity from a comparative construct into a developmental one. A second step is reducing informational environments that trigger comparison. Modern platforms exaggerate differences, amplify extremes, and present distorted representations of achievement. Identity cannot stabilize when constantly exposed to curated samples of other people's lives. This does not require isolation, but selective disengagement. Curating one's digital environment, reducing exposure to metrics, rankings, lifestyle displays, and social performance allows the mind to redirect its evaluative resources inward. Without constant external contrast, internal judgment has room to develop. The reduction of comparison triggers is not avoidance. It is a structural correction that restores balance. A third step is establishing cognitive independence from social perception. Many people underestimate how deeply their emotions react to perceived evaluation. Even without explicit feedback, the anticipation of judgment shapes behavior and thought. Independent identity requires recognizing this mechanism and neutralizing its influence. This involves asking, would I hold this belief if no one could see it? Would I pursue this goal if no one could approve of it? Would this choice remain meaningful in complete privacy? These questions separate authentic preferences from socially conditioned ones. When the mind repeatedly practices this separation, it weakens the emotional dependency on external validation. Another step is reinforcing the continuity of the self over time. Comparison fragments identity by focusing it on isolated moments, successes, failures, appearances, performances. Restoring identity requires a shift toward longitudinal thinking. Instead of evaluating oneself moment to moment, the individual must consider long-term patterns, values, and tendencies. Identity becomes coherent when it is grounded in enduring traits rather than fluctuating states. This continuity acts as a psychological stabilizer. It reduces susceptibility to temporary inadequacies and makes external contrasts less meaningful. A strong sense of personal continuity weakens the impact of comparison because identity becomes anchored in internal history, not external snapshots. A fifth component is developing tolerance for individual difference. Comparison becomes destructive when individuals treat differences as hierarchies. But many differences are simply differences, not indicators of superiority or inferiority. Reframing differences as variations rather than rankings reduces the psychological pressure to match others' traits or achievements. This shift requires intellectual discipline, recognizing that intelligence, success, attractiveness, and skill exist in diverse forms that cannot be meaningfully collapsed into a single scale. When the individual internalizes this, comparison loses its evaluative power, because the categories themselves lose their rigidity. Another essential step is restructuring motivation. Many goals people pursue originate from comparison, outperforming peers, matching standards, gaining recognition. These goals collapse when external feedback changes. To stabilize identity, motivation must shift from competitive to intrinsic reasoning. This requires asking, what tasks engage me regardless of external reward? What challenges align with my values rather than my insecurities? When motivation becomes self-generated, identity solidifies because it is built on personal logic rather than external contrast. A seventh element is strengthening internal self-observation. Comparison weakens the self because it prevents introspection. Attention is directed outward. Restoring identity requires consistent inward analysis, observing thoughts, emotional reactions, and behavioral patterns without immediately judging them through external standards. This form of self-observation develops a non-comparative understanding of oneself. Over time, the individual becomes more familiar with their mental architecture, reducing the need to look outward for definition. Self-knowledge replaces external evaluation as the primary tool for identity construction. Emotional regulation is also crucial. Comparison amplifies insecurity because emotions react strongly to perceived inferiority. When individuals strengthen emotional regulation, recognizing emotional triggers, separating sensation from interpretation, and delaying reactions, comparison loses its intensity. Emotional neutrality provides a buffer that prevents external differences from destabilizing identity. This neutrality is not detachment. It is the ability to evaluate self-worth without the immediate distortion of emotional discomfort. Another major component is accepting the limits of human diversity. People differ in capacities, circumstances, opportunities, and psychological structures. Many comparisons are invalid precisely because they ignore these differences. Recognizing the structural impossibility of equal outcomes reduces irrational self-criticism. When individuals understand that achievement is influenced by countless variables beyond personal control, they begin to interpret others' success less as a judgment on themselves and more as a separate phenomenon. Identity becomes more resilient because it is no longer shaped by unrealistic expectations. A further step is developing philosophical consistency. Independent identity relies on consistent principles, values that do not shift with social trends. This consistency provides a framework for interpreting one's actions and decisions without relying on external comparisons. People with clear principles are less reactive to others' lives because their behavior follows internal reasoning rather than external pressure. Without such principles, identity remains unstable and reactive. Finally, the restoration of identity requires recognizing that comparison cannot be eliminated entirely, but must be subordinated. The goal is not to remove comparison from human psychology. It cannot be removed, but to place it within a hierarchy where it no longer determines self-worth. Comparison becomes data, not judgment, information, not identity. When individuals view comparison as a cognitive mechanism rather than a verdict, they regain control over its influence. Taken together, these steps rebuilding internal reference points, reducing comparison triggers, cultivating cognitive independence, reinforcing continuity, reframing differences, restructuring motivation, strengthening self-observation, regulating emotion, recognizing diversity limits, establishing philosophical consistency, and subordinating comparison create a structure in which identity becomes internally stable. The individual no longer interprets themselves through the lens of others' lives. Instead, they develop a sense of self derived from their own reasoning, values, and long-term patterns. The result is not self-confidence in the conventional sense, but self-definition. And once a person becomes the author of their own identity, comparison loses its ability to diminish them. Autonomy replaces evaluation, clarity replaces insecurity, and identity becomes something constructed, not inherited from the expectations of others.